we'll alternate with questions, and I'll start with a very simple question, but it's a hard one, like all simple questions. The film is called CSSC, It Begins, The Coach, The Skull. And I was just wondering if you could tell us what begins and if it's still continuing or if it's become something else.
There are 2 films, 2 projects. Each of them have 3 parts. Each of them begin with a stagecoach, go to a way station, and then one goes to the attack in the woods of the dogs, and the other one goes to the saloon. When I wrote the first script, I described it as 3 stages of violence. Not that I believe that these 3 stages are inclusive to violence. It was just a kind of structure to use, but in a structure to write the script around. And the first one, which is the beginning, is the 6 people are in the coach. It's Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, Mary Magdalene, Jesus Christ, Adam and Eve. And they're traveling. Ronald and Nancy both know each other, they're husband and wife, but it's not Ronald Reagan. I didn't have the look of Ronald Reagan, I had the look of J.P. Morgan, but similar in connection, J.P. Morgan to Ronald Reagan. And then Reagan, I changed the name to Ray Gunn, which is in kind of homage to Hannah Wilke and Klaus Oldenburg in a certain way. And Mary and Jesus, it's not clear when you watch the film, are they Mary and Jesus? Is her name really Mary Magdalene, or is she making that up? And is his name Jesus Christ, or is he saying that in response to her saying Mary Magdalene? But they are a kind of couple in a certain way. They kind of pose themselves as a couple. And then the 2 characters, Adam and Eve, are just innocent. And they're young people, Adam and Eve, they're innocent, they don't know what's going on. The other 2 are forms of, you could say, libertines, or some form of that they know immediately, they realize there's a game to be played. The 2, Mary Magdalene, Jesus Christ, and Ronald and Nancy, realize there's a game to be played. And the game is to play a game in the coach on the 2 innocent ones. So the first stage of violence involves a kind of libertine attitude of let's fuck over the 2 innocent ones. They don't know what's coming. And yet, and these couples, the grown-up couples, in a way, know the game. Even though they don't maybe know each other, they know the game. And the violence in that case is a case of sexual abuse and verbal abuse, and just egging at them. They go to a way station. That's a second part, but when I wrote the script, it's in the first part. The second part of the film was to be where a group of men stop the coach late at night and then proceed to torture and rape and kill everybody in the coach. And of course, at that point, the libertines they're not up to that. The men in this case are just vicious. They're berserkers. It's not about gathering wealth. It's not about robbing the coach. It's just about this form of violence of a pack of men. And we know these kinds of situations, like from Vietnam or any of these kinds of whatever goes on in Syria, what happens in certain kinds of groups of men getting together. So that was the second part of the subject of violence. The third part, and that's a collusion of men. The third part is, after everybody in the coach is dead, the third part was they would go to a saloon. When they get to the saloon, the minute they go in the door, there's no alliance. The minute these dogs, as they're referred to, go in the saloon, there's no alliance, there's no connection. Everything breaks down. So then at that point, the violence becomes cross-violence. Anybody can kill anybody. Anybody can torture anybody. Any can fuck with anybody. It's no more alliance. It's just chaos violence in the saloon.
Daddy, I want to be his girl. Oh, yeah.
Part of, the answer to your question of what it's about, it's part of a progression. It's part of a process that's been going on. It's part of a kind of experiment. And it does deal with the nature of transgression. And there's an aspect of transformation. And there's a kind of flow where one thing leads to the other. The next project leads to the next project. So does it continue? The answer is, at this point, it's mostly about editing. I don't think we shoot any more of CS and DA, but for sure, the pieces that came after that, NV, AE, and the things going on now all relate to those pieces. So that's an intro to it, I guess.
When I think of your studio, I think it might be one of the world's most radical, truly independent film studios, actually. Mm-hmm. And that this idea of making movies somehow, like the idea of making movies, starts to form this integral part of your performances and these pieces, and it's somehow this I don't know, movie studios themselves are this, we recognize the kind of exalted like status of a movie studio, but somehow that gets introduced into these pieces, and it starts this series that's going on now, and all the pieces afterwards seem to be almost like this. You're taking it all in. The studio, the whole entire endeavor of a film studio starts to be more than a backdrop, but this integral part of even the idea-making process. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you would have some thoughts about in regards to these films?
I came to LA with this in the early 70s after, the European wave of Godard and Bergman and Tarkovsky and all this stuff happened. And I experienced a lot of those kinds of films in the 60s in San Francisco. And when I came to LA, there was this thing of coming out of experimental films. And experimental films, whatever, Brakhage, Kurt Kren, I come out of that, and there's some kind of thing about going to LA and thinking of LA in its underbelly, like it's B movie world. It's where there's something like San Francisco was such a hip place, but LA was so like different kinds of cultures and people, and Hollywood Boulevard was such a fucking, fuckhole in a certain way. And I was interested in all that. And I tried to, I go to film school and stuff like that. I tried to enter Hollywood, but in a way I wasn't interested. And at that same point is when video happened. And that changed everything, because video meant you didn't need a sound camera, which you couldn't afford. And you got access to the Aeroflex with the Nagra and all this stuff. All of a sudden video happened, and that, wow, sound. Not only sound, but now 30-minute reel. Like, not only 30-minute reel, but I could see what I'm making, like video. And of course, in film school, it was old guard. They didn't see that world. And then the art world saw that world, right? The art world saw video. And so making video, and I start making video, it's about structuralism and about the body and about, pushing the body or pushing the brain or pushing, sensibilities and stuff like that. But at some point, narrative happens. some point, a narrative happened when I began to use liquids. This is a weird combination. As soon as like the ketchup happens, as soon as the shit happens, as soon as the piss happens, some form of narrative. And also the subject of persona, like being a character, begins to happen. And it was out of the mainstream of what was going on, because most performance wasn't dealing with persona and character and narrative. But of course, I was looking at it in a very fucked up way. And then at some point I had a job working for Paramount, and I was in these sound stages, and those sound stages were so crazy. Like they would have a house, and you go in the house and then you enter the living room. But if you went out the door, which should be going to the kitchen, you just ended up in the back of the sound stage, and the kitchen was over there. And somehow these things themselves were interesting as objects, these fractured architectures and these sound stages. And then like kind of realizing how I looked at them wasn't how they looked at them. How I looked at them wasn't in the sense, I didn't see them as just a way to get to something. I saw them as really interesting in and of themselves. And this idea of appropriation and the appropriation of, the appropriation in art and the subject of appropriation, but then this idea of referring to my studio as a film studio, but knowing it was dysfunctional. And knowing it was dysfunctional, right? Like it can't make money. It can't make films that make money. I'm not interested, like whatever I'm going to make isn't going to make fucking money. And the idea that it's dysfunctional was interesting.
I, while working on a text that involves you, I came upon this quote on the grotesque by Victor Hugo, where he talks about how if classical drama was a flat mirror that was held up against the world, but put everything in this kind of flat, straight frame, that whatever modernity was going to do would be, on the one hand, grotesque, and if it were a mirror, it would be a distorting mirror, but like a convex mirror that would focus, intensify, but distort what it was showing. In your case, what are you targeting and what are you trying to throw back?
Well, one thing I was thinking about, I was reading an interview with Fun Games. Haneke, yeah, and I like his films. And in some ways, I think that we have similar interests, right? But one thing that came up is his notion of provocation, right? And that he wants to provoke. And he talks about provoking and provoking the audience. And I thought, I'm not sure this is true, but in some ways I thought, well, that's a filmmaker's attitude, a director's attitude, right? And he makes a film and he thinks about the audience. I'm not sure how far that goes with how many directors, and I'm sure it's not the case with all directors. But I was thinking that from an artist's point of view, and from, my trajectory goes, yeah, it's headed towards this idealism of what film could be, but quickly I move in a direction. I find my world in art. It's in video, but it's in performance, it's in actions, it goes that direction, and it's in the studio, and the early pieces are in the studio, and even now it's about the studio. Yeah, it's an appropriation maybe of a Hollywood studio, but really it's a studio. And this idea of being in the studio, and I'm not as aware of the audience. I don't think as much about them. So it becomes sort of a kind of looping and a process in my own psyche in a certain way. So, and it goes over time. Whatever this is moving in a direction for 40 years. Like this is where it got me, right? And recently in a theater piece, the critic wrote this thing that it was just about provocation. That night, as Adolf Hitler, I held up the newspaper from the review, and as this American Hitler said, this is not about provocation. I really don't give a shit what you think, and I'm not trying to change your mind. This is about, I think, in my own perception, it's existentialism. It's about existence. Well, what the fuck am I? What the fuck is this? And what is the glass of water? That, right? So something is connected to that. So this thing of like, what am I trying to do? Or what is it?